This brief reflection is going to be on Herakleitos, Aeschylus, and the Jewish Zeus. Now, most people wouldn't think of calling the Hebrew God El Shaddai, Elohim, Yahweh, Zeus. But in reading the Hebrew canon, or what Christians call the Old Testament, one gets a very mixed message in terms of who God is. And so often the question is, who speaks for God? So on the one hand, there is the God of mercy, the God who is long-suffering, the God who is patient, the God of justice, the God of peace, shalom. On the other hand, there is also the God of violence, the God of war, the God who's vindictive, the God of anger, the God of wrath. And so there are these two polarized perspectives of God. And in Deuteronomy, for example, which is probably the first political manifesto written in the West before Plato or Aristotle, we even get God commanding the Jewish people to go and commit genocide. And how are we to understand a God of justice, a God of peace, a God who talks about not killing, not stealing, 10 commandments, and yet very much commanding people not only to steal land, but to kill people and children and animals. And so we get on these two images of God, and obviously different people interpreting and speaking for God. So the question is, who speaks for God and whose interpretation of God? And a lot of contemporary discussions and dialogue are very much swirl around this particular question these days when reading the Bible, if one does not read it just devotionally and ask no critical questions. The other is to read it excessively critically and just dismiss it, as certain new atheists do, because of the violence, the war, the brutality, God choosing a certain people. But knowing how to read it thoughtfully, selectively, and judiciously is not easy, trying to make sense of who speaks for God and whose version of God. The early church had to grapple with this as well. You had the Gnostics, the Marcionites, grappling with what they saw the warlike God of the Hebrew canon or the Apocrypha. Gnostics did much the same. The church had to grapple with, were they going to keep the whole text, the Hebrew canon, Apocrypha, and emerging New Testament? If so, how are they going to read that as seen through the eyes of Christ, who seems to be so different in many ways than, in fact, elements of the God of the Old Testament? So some of the questions today which are being discussed is the violence of the Old Testament, how one makes sense of it, the penal theory of the atonement, how one makes sense of that, given the fact there are 6 notions of the atonement, and the issue of eternal damnation or eternal punishment for people who do not accept God in this life or Christ in this life. Now, these questions were not new. These questions, in terms that are being discussed, recycled today, they're very old questions. They were asked in the 1st, 2nd centuries, but the Greeks were also asking these questions. And some of the major Greek thinkers of the time were grappling with exactly the same questions in the 6th and 5th centuries of the Common Era. The two leading literary figures, what we call orthodox Greek thought in relationship to its theology per se, were the two great works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Hesiod's works. These became the standard texts in terms of understanding Greek myth, in terms of the gods, the warfare between the gods, and the relationship of the Olympians to humans. Now, Zeus, within a certain read of Zeus anyway, within Greek myth, could be very, very much the authoritarian, the tyrant. Those who dared to differ with them amongst the gods or the titans themselves could be punished very, very quickly, very efficiently, and very effectively. There was no discussion, and also it was the same with humans or mortals. And in that sense, the Zeus of the Olympians has a lot of affinity with a certain interpretation of the God of the Jews. Now, how were Greek philosophers, how were Greek literary people to make sense of this interpretation of Zeus? Were they just uncritically buy into it? That's the very nature of reality itself, as the ultimate engages with the penultimate, or eternity with time, or God with humans? Or was this perhaps a distorted understanding of the divine that led to tragic implications, not only for humans, but for an understanding of God? Now, two thinkers, as I mentioned, emerged. One, a philosopher, Herakleitos, the other, probably the most significant Greek tragedian, Aeschylus, who grappled with these very issues. Heraclitus, considered one of the more significant pre-Socratic philosophers, was very suspicious in his aphorisms, and he wrote many brilliant little aphorisms of the way Zeus and the Greek gods were portrayed in the sort of orthodox or classical Greek myth. And his notion of the logos was very significant in this, arguing that there is a dynamic reality that in fact transcends these authoritarian, tyrannical Olympian gods. Interesting enough, Herakleitos, Hera, coming from the Greek goddess who was wed to Zeus, so you get in many ways the divine feminine Herakleitos, and then Kleitos, we get our Greek notion of the church, ecclesia, called out, summoned, welcomed. And so in Herakleitos' philosophy, as he engages a certain orthodox view from Homer and Hesiod of the Greeks, he's articulating philosophically, and again, philosophy, love of wisdom. What does it mean to love wisdom? Well, in Heraclitus, he's threading together two terms. The divine feminine, who invokes in terms of a critique of an authoritarian notion of the male itself. And so it's significant that Heraclitus uses these, and the logos is very significant for him. And so for Herakleitos, which of course John uses in the beginning, was the word archehologos in that sense, is the presencing of an ultimate reality that cannot be reduced into a tyrant, an authoritarian God, a God who punishes if one dares to question, dares to disobey in a minimal way. And so you get this clash in Herakleitos in terms of philosophy and the ultimate reality of the logos summoning, inviting, welcoming people into a much richer and fuller feast of reality that transcends the Zeus of Greek myth in that sense. And so we can see how Herakleitos is very engaged at this point in 5th century Greek philosophical thought in calling into question a certain way of understanding theology and the relationship of Zeus, the Olympians, to humans. The other is Aeschylus, a contemporary of Herakleitos. There were two myths about Prometheus and Zeus. One is the Zeus, again, who's the authoritarian, the father figure, the tyrant that brooks no opposition, that allows no questioning, no doubting in any way, but also forbids humans from truly being free because he demands obedience. He insists on humans following his every thought and action, and if not, the thunderbolts will come and the weather will turn on people. And Prometheus, which means in Greek foresight or insight, dares to question this understanding of Zeus. And as a result of this, which is very interesting for us today in terms of myth, Zeus sends Hermes. We get our word hermeneutics from this, or Hermes interprets Zeus, but interprets Zeus in a particular way, which leads to a going after Prometheus, one of the great titans, which dared to question Zeus and the Olympians. And it's Hermes and Zeus that come together, that take Prometheus, that chain him to the rocks, so he cannot in any way get out from his imprisonment. And initially, Zeus says eagles will pluck out his liver again and again, but because Prometheus dares to even question that, Zeus says, I will turn vultures on your liver. Interesting enough, when Zeus has Hermes, take him up the mountain to be chained so the vultures will again and again torture him. He's taken to the Cyclops. In Greek myth, once again, the Cyclops are one-eyed monsters in that sense, who only can see in a reductionistic manner. So in this myth, which is very, very interesting, the notion is that there is Zeus. There is one interpretation of Zeus. This is Hermes. He punishes Prometheus for daring to ask meaningful questions about the nature of God, who comes across very, very much as an authoritarian tyrant who punishes people either quickly or over the long term if they oppose him. Prometheus, who's noted for his insight and his wisdom in trying to assist humans in a just and peaceful way, he's punished by the Zeus god. A certain interpretation of Zeus, that is Hermes or hermeneutics, led up the rock face, and it is the Cyclops which chain Prometheus to the rocks. And so there's this understanding in Greek myth in which an interpretation of Zeus by Hermes is one-dimensional, the Cyclops, and anyone who dares to care for justice and peace for humans in any way is going to be punished for daring to question a God who's unjust, not peaceful, and a tyrant. And so Prometheus is the symbol of wisdom and insight in many ways. Now, Aeschylus's read of Prometheus and Zeus, which is a tragic read in many ways, but for Aeschylus in many ways, he becomes the Christ-like figure, and Thomas Merton will use this also in his two myths of Prometheus in his work. 1961, his book came out, The Behavior of Titans, so it's the anniversary in 2021, in which he looks at two reads of Prometheus and Zeus. Prometheus, in this sense, the other read, it is Christ, or Prometheus in Greek myth, who comes to deconstruct a certain understanding of the tyrant Zeus, or in a certain read of the Hebrew canon, to deconstruct a warrior, a violent god, which of the Hebrew canon, which actually is more like Zeus in some ways. And Prometheus, like Christ, is willing to die to deconstruct a certain image, understanding, interpretation of God and bring fire or light to humans. And of course, fire is very essential here, not literal fire. Herakleitos uses the metaphor of fire again and again, as does Aeschylus and Prometheus of insight. The metaphor of fire is those things that have to burn within us so we truly become, or the ego that has to burn so that the pure gold of our eternal being or deified being will emerge. So fire is one of those perennial symbols, of course, like the phoenix itself. It burns in fire, it resurrects in the new being. So Prometheus, in that sense, like anticipates Christ, the dying God, who's willing to suffer to deconstruct a notion of God which very, very much undermines, distorts, caricatures the true God, the one who desires light, life, fire to be brought so men and women can live at the highest and fullest means possible. So when we think of the great Greek philosopher Herakleitos, understanding of the Logos, which is quite different from the Greek notion of Zeus. When we think of Aeschylus's tragedy on Prometheus, we have the Christ-like figure who once again is willing to die, to deconstruct, even be punished in that sense, to deconstruct by humans in this sense, and it's humans' interpretation of the divine, so one will get a full understanding of the light and fire of reality. And so in these early Greek thinkers, we already have many of the questions that people are grappling with today. Many of the questions that were thought through in the first century by the church were already being thought through, grappled with, interrogated, pondered through Greek myth and different ways of reading Greek myth. Remembering Greek myth is just eternal truths wrapped in the garment of a story. Sadly so, many people tend to see myth occasionally as an untruth, and this largely comes from the first century BC Roman thinker Varro, who said there's three ways of doing theology: myth, politics, and natural theology. Myth was of the poets, which would be untruth. Political theology was where the gods were used to serve the state, and natural theology is one of the philosophers. Augustine picks this up in The City of God and follows Varro's lead, and largely through Augustine we also get the notion that myth is untruth and can't be trusted in any ways. And in the first few books of The City of God, he follows Varro very, very closely on this. But if we understand myth in the better sense, in terms of eternal truths wrapped in the garments of the story, we can see how Herakleitos, we can see how Aeschylus is raising the big questions about their understanding of the gods and Zeus that really do more to imprison people in a cage of a very, very narrow-minded thinking, reductionism that the Cyclops were about, and how a certain interpretation, Hermes or hermeneutics, which is like the Cyclops, one-dimensional, in fact distorts ultimate reality. And tragically so, many of the women and men who dare to ask these very questions about a certain god of the Hebrew canon, or in the Greek sense of Zeus, they're often like Prometheus or like Christ, marginalized. They're the ones who suffer. They're the ones who are seen as the heretics. They're the ones who are seen as the apostates. But in fact, they are the ones who truly bring light and life. And in this sense, both the classical Greek pre-Socratics like Herakleitos and the first of their great tragedians, Aeschylus, much better in many ways than Sophocles and Euripides, they anticipate the questions that will be raised in the 4th century. Of course, many Jews have raised these questions as well. Whose God in the Hebrew canon can be trusted and why? And then the early Christians pick this up, and today itself, many of the most thoughtful women and men are grappling with the God of violence of the Hebrew canon. And is this the God of Christ? The penal theory of the atonement, how does one make sense of that? And the Father, Son, and then eternal punishment, how does that square with a God of love? And so Herakleitos and Aeschylus very much deconstruct the Olympian Zeus in the same way thoughtful people today are deconstructing a certain notion of God in the Old Testament, which in most ways is at odds with Jesus Christ.